Okay, this afternoon we have Chuck Weise. Chuck is a meteorologist and professional pilot. Chuck holds a Bachelor's of Science degree in Atmospheric Sciences from the Oregon State University in 1979. I was 6 years old. With a minor in mathematics. Chuck has 25 years experience in operational meteorology and weather forecasting for media and private clients. Chuck is also a forensics meteorologist for the legal community and inventor of the windicator. No, it did not say 107 like they showed earlier. I photoshopped with that. Chuck has also held various positions on the Executive Council of the Oregon Chapter of the American Meteorological Society over the years. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Chuck Weise.
Hey, thanks for coming this afternoon. This has been a wonderful turnout, and I'm glad that everybody's here to listen to something new that it's actually not exactly new that we're going to be talking about today, but the components that I'm going to talk about and that Gordon Fulks will talk about certainly are, because we're taking the opposite viewpoint about human-caused climate change. And the only thing I regret about today's presentation is that there isn't enough time to cover everything that we would like to do. But thanks to Steve, and thanks to the AMS, and thanks to ONSI, we're going to take care of this problem on the 29th of November. So mark that on your calendars, because at that time, there will be another presentation which will be much more in-depth than the one I'm going to give you and that Gordon will give you today to cover this very topic, because it deserves a lot more time than we're able to give it in a short half hour that we have today. So I'll have kind of a warm-up presentation to give about this today, and I'm going to give only one component of why I don't think the humans are causing global climate change, and that's going to be looking at the temperature record. Gordon has some other viewpoints from a physicist standpoint of view that are, from his perspective, pointing more and more every day to the idea that this entire scientific argument now is waning away to more of a political than scientific discussion. And he'll give you his reasons for that as well. I'm going to introduce Gordon now because we don't have a lot of time to do introductions, but Gordon is an astrophysicist from the University of Chicago. I met Gordon because he started developing an interest in my perspective on the global warming human component of it several years ago. And a little bit about Gordon. His father, Joe Fulks, was the meteorologist in charge of the National Weather Service in Chicago for his entire career. One of our executive members, Charlie Ferris, actually worked for him for a number of years. But Gordon decided to study something more boring like physics instead of becoming a meteorologist, so that was, unfortunately, just kidding, Gordon. Actually, physics is an integral part of atmospheric science, and I say that jokingly about him. He's a brilliant man, like so many physicists that are in our country today. He has a lot to add to this, and I'm going to let him take the podium right away. I will follow up and take a look at the temperature records, and I'll give you some of the explanations for what I think is going on with those. So without further ado, ladies and gentlemen, Gordon Fulks.
Thank you very much. My name is Gordon Fulks. I have a tie-in to the American Meteorological Society here because my father was a member many years ago after he retired, being MIC in Chicago for 19 years. Prior to that, though, in fact, 65 years ago, he was involved with military forecasting, and at the end of the Second World War, the year I was born, he spent some time in Berlin setting up the German Meteorological Service again after we had destroyed it. So there's a tie-in to the combat meteorologists also. But let me get on with my presentation here. Figure out some of the mechanics of it here. Thank you for inviting me. This is history in the making. The first time those of us who question climate orthodoxy and climate alarmism have been invited to speak to the Oregon chapter of the American Meteorological Society. Chuck and I would like to thank particularly the new president, Steve Pierce, for extending an invitation to us, something his predecessors would not do. Now everyone in attendance will be able to judge for themselves whether or not we face an imminent climate catastrophe. But what sort of catastrophe are warmers talking about? Are we to be burning in hell by the end of the century as if condemned to the netherworld in Dante's Inferno? Or are they just worried about a milder winter with less valley snow? Are they worried about a return of another Columbus Day storm or another Hurricane Katrina, the melting of the Greenland ice cap, the Arctic sea ice, or just the remaining glaciers on Mount Hood? Or are they worried that you might come to your senses and no longer support their insatiable appetite for research grants? The answer is all of these and anything more that they think seems scary. For them, it's Halloween all year long. This topic has become such a catch-all for hysteria, largely because we've let it become so, not because there's really much to worry about. How do we discuss such an amorphous topic with so many tentacles? Well, first, we don't try to do so in the half hour allotted to us today. The scientific substance of what we have to say will be presented 1 month hence on Tuesday, November 29th at 7 p.m. right here at OMSI, I think, in this room. On that evening, Chuck and I will have the very able assistance of Oregon's former state climatologist, George Taylor. He is one of Oregon's true heroes. Today, though, we'll cover only the basics, a few of the topics. Let me be very clear as to what question we are discussing. We are addressing the supposition that human emissions of carbon dioxide are warming the Earth's surface in a significant way. This is so-called global warming. We are not addressing climate change, because that's practically a truism. The Earth's climate is always changing, because we live on a fluid planet with vast oceans and atmosphere that are never in complete equilibrium. They never have been, and they never will be. A little history is in order. Who do you suppose first raised the issue that the burning of fossil fuels might be warming, might lead to a warming of the planet? No, you're wrong. It was not Al Gore. It was a conservative British government led by Margaret Thatcher. She was in a desperate battle with British coal unions and wanted an excuse to move Great Britain toward nuclear power. Her scientific advisors suggested that she point to the rising levels of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and blame the burning of coal. Soon afterward, Al Gore recognized the political possibilities of leading an environmental movement based on this theme and utilizing the many young people set adrift by the collapse of communism. Hence, global warming often has little to do with science and everything to do with politics. Global warming is frequently the cause toward a political end, where proponents want you to think they're serious about the science, but are far more focused on what they can sell you if you believe in their politicized version of the science. Now let's try this. While many of us were still debating the various arguments offered in support of the theory of catastrophic global warming, meteorologist Chuck Weise cut through all of the fog a couple of years ago to the essential conclusion. The scientific case for global warming has completely collapsed. He will tell you in a few minutes some of the reasons why he reached that sweeping, and I believe correct scientific conclusion. Chuck and I agree that the planet has warmed between 1/2 and 1 degree centigrade over the last 150 years, as we've come out of the Little Ice Age and as the sun has reached a grand maximum in solar cycles about 10 years ago. This is certainly global warming, but not in our view man-made global warming, and certainly not catastrophic global warming. Many scientists have come to agree with this, but that hasn't stopped the hysteria because of statements like this. President Obama makes the political case for global warming. Few challenges facing America and the world are more urgent than combating climate change. The science is beyond dispute and the facts are clear. That's a pretty outrageous statement that is certainly out of date, but it has never been retracted, just put on a back burner to await a future opportunity to resurrect it. Do you think that the president really believes it? I doubt it, but he certainly wants you to believe it, and if you do, he has a carbon tax he'd like to sell you. Let's consider what more than 100 scientists said in a letter of reply. With all due respect, Mr. President, that is not true. We, the undersigned scientists, maintain that the case for alarm is grossly exaggerated. Mr. President, your characterization of the facts regarding climate change and the degree of uncertainty informing the scientific debate is simply incorrect. The letter was signed by some of the most respected scientists in the world today, note especially Professor Ivar Gaever. He received the Nobel Prize in Physics and is a Democrat who campaigned for Obama. He was also in the news recently when he resigned from the American Physical Society over their continued support for climate hysteria. Professor Richard Lindzen of MIT is widely recognized as the greatest meteorologist alive today. Professor of Advanced Physics Antonio Zucchi is president of the World Federation of Scientists. The full letter was published in 2009 as a full-page ad in many newspapers. It disproves the universal agreement that alarmists claim. A very famous man from another generation refutes the concept of settled science in a single sentence. Rudyard Kipling was the youngest man ever to receive the Nobel Prize in Literature and the first in the English language. The selling of global warming, Obama style, depends fundamentally on a vast scientific illiteracy in the general population. It also depends on people not recognizing that a much different logic applies in politics than in science. In politics, people typically decide where they want to go and backfill reasoning as a series of talking points. In contrast, the logic of science is a rigorous process requiring honest evidence and from independent testing. It is decidedly not democratic, as Galileo understood 400 years ago. Despite what the political authorities of his day, the Roman Inquisition, maintained, Jupiter has a certain number of moons that can be ascertained by careful observation. Galileo, like all scientists, believed that there exists an objective reality independent of politics and religion. Just as it is not democratic, so it is not authoritarian. While scientists do not vote on what constitutes good science, they also do not follow the pronouncements of authorities ultimately under political control. It is just as Galileo said, in questions of science, the authority of 1,000 is not worth the humble reasoning of a single individual. The most fundamental attribute of a scientist isn't brilliance or superior knowledge, but an utter honesty that goes beyond what an average citizen might consider honesty. This slide shows what the legendary professor of physics, Richard Feynman, said at Caltech about utter honesty. We certainly know from ClimateGate that many scientists do not come anywhere close to utter honesty, and in fact are closer to the concept of political talking points. If the talking points have been tested on the population and work, they will use them. Honesty is never part of the equation. Many of you know that the ClimateGate emails revealed the existence of a climate cartel intent on dominating the scientific process so that challenges to the dominant dialectic involving carbon dioxide cannot be effectively mounted. Conspirators maintain a tight grip on the scientific societies, including the American Geological Society, and their publication processes. Scientists at the very top of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change have become bullies. More important, ClimateGate revealed that many scientists have been cheating in many different ways, usually mixing a little truth with a great deal of rubbish. Let's examine one of the major arguments and point out where the truth really lies. This should be a plot familiar to many because Al Gore uses it. It's a plot of the Antarctic temperature and carbon dioxide climate reconstructions over the past 450,000 years, nearly 500,000 years. It shows the strong correlation between temperature and carbon dioxide that Gore touts as proof that carbon dioxide drives temperature changes. What he ignores is what scientists have known for more than a decade. Temperature leads carbon dioxide by about 800 years in the ice core record, proving that carbon dioxide is a follower of climate, not a major driver. The oceans have vast stores of carbon dioxide that they release as the climate warms and absorb as the climate cools. Note the very regular pattern of ice ages lasting about 90,000 years, followed by brief interglacial warm periods lasting about 10,000 years. The last interglacial period on the far right is the present Holocene that has already continued for about 10,000 years. Although men likely walked the Earth during the entire history that you see, the ascent of man did not occur until this present warm interglacial period. And let me see if I can point that out. That is it right there. Most of modern human history occurred during that period. Now let's go to a blow-up of our present Holocene. In other words, that little area that I showed before, which was part of a 450,000 year history, now we show just the last 10 or 11,000 years. In this case, the ice core data comes not from Antarctica, but from the Greenland ice sheet. However, it shows the same temperature history. The medieval warm period, about 1000 AD, is well confirmed by many studies and represents a warmer period in our recent past than the modern warm period, which peaked in 1998. And let's see if we can show that here. This is the medieval warm period, and then you see other warm periods there. Note the precipitous drop after the medieval peak leading to the Little Ice Age, which lasted until the modern warm period began about 1830. And you can see this, the turn-up right there is 1830. The full extent of the modern warm period is not shown in this plot because ice cores are not considered reliable until the ice is consolidated. If the plot were continued to the present day, it would likely show the modern peak to be a little lower than the medieval peak. We know that Greenland was warmer when the Vikings were there during the medieval warm period. The entire history of this 10,000-year interglacial period, known as the Holocene, showed many warm periods spaced at roughly 1,000-year intervals. Our ancestors clearly benefited from these previous warm periods and obviously had no part in causing them. Note the Roman and Minoan warm periods. Roman and Minoan. During the Roman warm period, the great Carthaginian general Hannibal was able to march war elephants across the Alps to attack the Romans. Such a feat is not possible today because of snow and ice in the mountain passes. The gradually declining average temperature over the Holocene is part of the Milankovitch cycles. These involve variations in the Earth's orbit about the sun caused primarily by the planet Jupiter. Since recent climate changes are well within the changes that we know occurred in the past, the most straightforward explanation for them is clearly natural causes. That is called the law of parsimony, or Occam's razor, after the 14th century Franciscan friar, Father William of Occam. What could the causes of recent climate changes be, and what does that mean for our future? Well, you just have to wait till next month to find out when we have more time. Before I turn things over to Chuck, though, I want to show this slide, which is a little more complex than the others. It's prepared by Dr. Roger Cohen, who is a fellow of the American Physical Society. Using climate data from the UN IPCC, he plotted global surface temperature as a function of atmospheric carbon dioxide. It shows what climate alarmists never want you to see, a climate sensitivity far lower than they predict with their billion-dollar climate codes. Yet it uses their favorite data. Using this chart to predict the temperature increase expected from increased carbon dioxide by the end of the century gives a nominal 1 degree centigrade, far less than they want you to believe, and certainly not catastrophic. Even this is likely an overestimate, as we will discuss at the meeting on November 29. I'll let Professor Richard Lindzen of MIT have the last word. The need to courageously resist climate hysteria is clear. Thank you for listening. Chuck, it's your turn now.
Okay, thanks, Gordon. And I'll start my presentation now, and I'm just going to kind of continue a little bit about what Gordon was talking about, primarily looking at the temperature records, because they're very revealing if you think about things. And I'll point some interesting situations about them and some interesting contradictions based upon what people say about climate change. We're not going to go into the physics too much today because we just don't have time to do it. So I'm limiting the discussion basically to temperatures. We've pretty much gone over this with Gordon. In the realm of politicized science, global warming is a fact, but in the realm of real science, where real evidence is required, I think Gore's theories completely collapse. That's my opinion, but I'm not in this alone. There's a lot of people who feel the same way that I do. And again, Gordon talked about the 100 or all the scientists who signed the statement to disagree with the president's claims about global warming. The Oregon Petition Project statement also did the same thing with this in it, saying there's no convincing scientific evidence that human release of carbon dioxide, methane, or other greenhouse gases is causing or will cause catastrophic heating of the Earth's atmosphere. Moreover, there is substantial evidence that increases in atmospheric carbon dioxide produce many beneficial effects upon the natural plant and animal environments of the Earth. Now, that was signed by 31,000 American physical scientists. 9,000 of those had PhDs. So the claim that there is a consensus on global warming is simply false. It's not true. There are many people who disagree with this concept, and the media doesn't want to report this. I'm going to pick on the Clackamas County Office of Sustainability a little bit today, because Gordon and I have been following them around, and they have been engaged very heavily in climate alarmism in our local area. And this is part of what they showed at their last presentation. I emailed them asking them for explanations, but to date I get no response. This is a flyer that they handed out, and it shows century of warming, global temperature changes, and it shows on the left how cold things were between 1880 and 1889. And then they show between 2000 and 2009 how the temperatures changed over a century, over the last century. Well, you look at that on the face of it, you go, gee, things must be heating up pretty good here, so maybe there is a change or an argument to be made about the human-caused climate change thing. But what do you think the problem with this temperature comparison is? Does anybody have a clue? Well, it does not, and it incorrectly asserts the climate has warmed steadily from 1880 to 2009. That's the inference they want you to believe on the flyer. But the fact of the matter is, the climate has done no such thing, and this completely ignores the cyclical nature of the temperatures. We're going to start off by taking a look at the temperature record with something that has been already thoroughly discredited. This is the infamous hockey stick graph from Michael Mann from Penn State, and it's been discredited by the Wegman report to the National Academy of Sciences. Now notice what they do with this when they want to engage in climate alarmism is they take a part of the temperature record, not all of it, that's the key to this thing. They don't take the whole record. They want you to look at the part that looks juicy to them and do a sell job. You go back 1,000 years in the record, and the ice core records from that Gordon showed you, and also oxygen isotope records off the Arctic and Greenland. They both show the same thing. The last 1,000 years, the climate is relatively stable, slightly cooling. And then suddenly it takes a huge uptick at the end, and then they say there's nothing in the record that shows the climate did anything until now. So this is an unprecedented warming, and it's got to be caused by carbon emissions. Well, let's take a look further back in the record. This graph came from Bob Carter, but it's similarly constructed of what Gordon already showed you. And notice the time period. Rewind the clock to 1,000 years. Right here. Their graph was cut off here and went up to here, and then they mixed the instrumental temperature record with the ice core record. Now, why would they do that if they have this to look at? Well, the answer is obvious. They didn't want you to know that prior to 1,000 years, there were significant periods where the ice core record shows the Earth was a lot warmer than it is today. And those periods were the medieval warm period, the Roman warm period, that goes back to Christ's time on Earth, and then the Minoan. So there's nothing unprecedented in the ice core record that would support this conclusion that the last temperature rise we experienced was unprecedented in the record. It simply isn't there. Here's a look at the global satellite temperatures from the University of Alabama at Huntsville. This is today probably considered one of the most accurate temperature records we have because it doesn't have some of the problems we have with the instruments after the Weather Service went to the modernization and restructuring program in the 80s. They got rid of their dedicated observing and went to automated stations. And meteorologists who looked at the placement of the stations and other things see a lot of problems with those records that affect the temperature record of the land over the last 50 to 100 years. But in this record, we don't see anything unprecedented either. We start out fairly cool in 1979 when the records were first obtained with the orbiting satellites, and then we warmed slightly. The question is, are we still warming now? That's an important question because we have to compare what's going on to what the climate modeling is telling us. And the climate modeling is what everybody hangs their hat on or claims is the answer to whether the warming will continue and whether CO2 is the cause of it. Well, here's the instrumental record, and this goes back 100 years, and it is what was in that Office of Sustainability flyer I just showed you. Notice they draw a trend line in the instrumental record starting around 1900, and if you draw a trend line, it shows we've had some warming. But have we had warming the whole time? We have not. Notice the cyclic nature of things. The trend line only tells you it got warmer from the last period you looked at to where you're at now. And the trend is 0.12 of a degree upward per decade, if you want to calculate it that way. But the problem with a lot of these things is, where do you start, where do you end? I can take this point back here and go back on the ice core record, and if I do that where it was significantly warmer at some of those warmer periods, this trend line would vanish. It would either be zero or show we're actually cooling if you go back further in time. So you have to ask yourself, what's the significance of this trend? And they try to blame it on climate, but how can they do that when the longer instrumental record doesn't show any such thing? Here's the close-up between 1950 and 1975 from the NCDC. We dropped 0.16 of a degree per decade then, But what was happening with global atmospheric CO2? It was going up. That's an inconsistency. And nobody has an explanation for it. Aha! This is very significant because now look at the land records of the continental United States from 1998 to now. This is over all 50 of the contiguous states. The trend for the last 10 years is down almost a full degree Fahrenheit. Where is CO2? It's at a record high since the Industrial Revolution started. We're up about 390 parts per million by volume. There's a huge problem in taking climate modeling, which projects warming will continue, when in fact the temperatures are falling now, and making the argument that CO2 is causing global warming. It makes no sense. It means one of two things. Your sensitivities are completely screwed up, and they're just wrong, and the record shows that, or they're way far off reality. There's a signal there somewhere, but it sure isn't showing up in anything we can find in the real records. In summary, according to the satellite, ice core data, and land-based temperature records, there's no evidence that global temperatures have warmed to any level that's unprecedented. Just look in the record. The hysteria is wrong about this. U.S. land continent areas have negative temperature trends now and have for over 10 years, falsifying the claims made by climate alarmists and climate models. And think about this. Where would you expect to see the first change in temperature if the climate is warming or cooling? Would it be over the ocean or over the land? It would be over the land. That's absolutely right. And the reason is that the specific heat capacity of land versus water are drastically different. The heat capacity of the oceans is much greater. They will not respond as fast as a change in the radiative balance of the Earth compared to the land. So the obvious question is, if CO2 is forcing warming on the climate, you would not expect the land temperatures to fall like they have for 10 years. Other major scientific evidence will be presented November 29th at a special meeting of the Oregon chapter of the AMS here at OMSI, when lesser time constraints will allow for a more thorough treatment of the various topics we need to redress to complete the entire picture. And believe me, there's a lot of interesting stuff out there. I think you'll all enjoy hearing more about this, and I look forward to that presentation along with Gordon and George Taylor. Thanks very much for listening.
Hang on there just for a sec, Chuck. Thank you, Chuck, Ron, and Dr. Fulks. Okay.